Imagine living in a world where bread doesn't exist. No sandwiches, no pizza, no burgers, no toast. For over 99% of human history, that's exactly how people lived. So, who was the first person crazy enough to grind tiny grains into powder, mix them with water, and throw it into a fire? Even stranger, bread may have been discovered completely by accident, and it changed human history forever. Long before supermarkets, bakeries, or even farms, there was no bread. In fact, if you traveled back more than 12,000 years, the idea of eating a sandwich would seem completely impossible. Humans lived in a world where every meal had to be found, hunted, or gathered from nature. There were no wheat fields stretching across the horizon, no ovens, no flour, no recipes passed down through generations. Our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. Every morning was a gamble. They followed herds of animals, searched forests for berries, dug up edible roots, gathered nuts, and caught fish whenever they could. Some days they returned with plenty of food. Other days they returned with almost nothing. Survival depended on movement. If food disappeared from one area, people packed everything they owned and moved somewhere else. They had no reason to stay in one place because nature decided where the next meal would be. Yet, hidden among the tall grasses growing across the hills were tiny seeds that would eventually change everything. Wild wheat and barley had always existed. Every summer, their golden heads swayed in the wind, scattering thousands of seeds across the ground. But to early humans, these plants didn't seem very useful. Each seed was incredibly small. Collecting enough to satisfy even one person could take hours of backbreaking work. Compared to hunting a deer or gathering a basket of fruit, picking individual grains hardly seemed worth the effort. So for thousands of years, most people simply walked past them. But not everyone. At some point, someone looked at those tiny seeds and wondered a simple question. What if these could become food? No one knows who that person was. Their name has been lost for tens of thousands of years. But that single moment of curiosity may have sparked one of the greatest discoveries in human history. Those tiny grains didn't look like much, yet inside them was the beginning of bread and the foundation of civilization itself. Imagine trying to make dinner, not by hunting a single animal or picking a handful of berries, but by collecting thousands of tiny seeds, one by one. That's exactly what our ancestors faced. Scattered across the hills of the Middle East grew wild grasses, especially wild wheat and barley. At first glance, they looked ordinary. They weren't colorful, they didn't produce sweet fruit, and they certainly didn't seem worth the effort. But hidden inside each grass head were small, hard seeds packed with energy. These seeds were rich in carbohydrates, the fuel our bodies turn into energy. They could also be stored much longer than fresh fruit or meat, making them an incredibly reliable source of food. The problem was that no one had figured out how to use them efficiently. Collecting them was painfully slow. A single handful wasn't enough for a meal. Early humans had to gather thousands of grains under the hot sun, carefully pulling them from their stalks. Then they had to remove the tough outer husks before the grains could even be eaten. And after all that work, the reward wasn't exactly impressive. Try chewing a handful of raw wheat kernels today, and you'll quickly understand why. They're hard, dry, and almost impossible to digest. Your teeth would do most of the work, and your stomach wouldn't get much nutrition from them. For a long time, these tiny seeds remained little more than an emergency food, something people ate only when better options weren't available. But then, someone noticed something remarkable. If the grains were crushed between two stones, they transformed into a fine powder. It wasn't bread yet. It wasn't even dough. But for the first time, humans had discovered something revolutionary: flour. That simple discovery unlocked possibilities no one had imagined. A hard seed that was difficult to eat could now be mixed, shaped, cooked, and transformed into something entirely new. It was the first step toward one of the greatest food inventions in human history. At first, flour wasn't enough. Early humans could grind wild grains into a rough powder, but eating it dry was no better than eating the seeds themselves. The powder stuck to their mouths, scattered in the wind, and was almost impossible to swallow. So they tried something different. They mixed the flour with water. The result was a thick, sticky paste, not very appetizing, but much easier to eat than hard grains. It was likely consumed as a simple porridge for many generations. Yet no one knew they were only one accident away from changing human history. Picture a small campfire at the end of a long day. A group of hunter-gatherers sits around the flames, cooking meat and keeping warm as the sun disappears. Nearby, someone has prepared a bowl of grain paste. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe the bowl tipped over. Or perhaps they intentionally spread a little of the paste onto a hot, flat stone beside the fire to see what would happen. No one knows the exact moment, but something incredible did happen. The heat slowly drove the water out of the paste. The soft mixture began to firm up. Its surface turned golden, the edges became crisp, and a rich, roasted aroma filled the air. Instead of a sticky paste, there was now a flat, cooked cake. The very first bread was probably nothing like the fluffy loaves we know today. It had no yeast, no air pockets, and no soft interior. It was thin, dense, and chewy, more like a modern flatbread or cracker than a sandwich loaf. But it had one enormous advantage. It was portable. Unlike porridge, it could be carried on long journeys. It lasted longer before spoiling, was easier to share, and provided a reliable source of energy while hunting or traveling. Without realizing it, those early humans had solved a problem that had existed for thousands of years. A tiny wild seed had become a food that could feed entire families. And although they couldn't have known it at the time, this simple flatbread was only the beginning. Because within a few thousand years, humans would make an even bigger discovery. One that would turn this hard, flat cake into the soft, fluffy bread found on tables all around the world. For thousands of years, bread remained simple. It was flat, dense, and made from whatever wild grains people could gather. But then, around 12,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Humans stopped wandering. Instead of chasing food across forests and grasslands, they began growing it. This period, known as the Agricultural Revolution, completely transformed human life. In a region historians call the Fertile Crescent, stretching across parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and the surrounding areas, people started planting wild wheat and barley instead of simply collecting them. For the first time, food wasn't left to chance. Every harvest brought thousands upon thousands of grains. What had once taken days to gather could now be produced in massive quantities. And that changed everything. With a dependable food supply, people no longer had to move constantly in search of their next meal. Families built permanent homes. Villages appeared. Those villages slowly expanded into towns, and eventually, the world's first cities. Bread became more than just something to eat. It became the foundation of daily life. Farmers grew grain. Millers crushed it into flour. Bakers turned that flour into food. For one of the first times in history, entire communities depended on each other. People no longer had to do everything themselves. Civilization was taking shape. But despite all this progress, there was one problem. Bread was still hard. It was heavy, flat, and dense. Nothing like the soft loaves we know today. The biggest breakthrough hadn't happened yet. And when it finally did, it may have begun with something most people would have thrown away. A forgotten bowl of dough left sitting for too long. Imagine spending hours making dough, only to forget about it. Most people would assume it had gone bad. But thousands of years ago, that simple mistake may have led to one of the greatest discoveries in food history. Around 5,000 years ago, in ancient Egypt, bread had already become a daily staple. Bakers mixed flour with water every day, preparing dough for families, workers, and entire communities. Then something unexpected happened. A bowl of dough was left sitting in the warm air. Invisible to the human eye, wild yeast, tiny living microorganisms naturally floating in the environment, landed on the dough. As the yeast fed on the natural sugars in the flour, it released tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide. Slowly, the dough began to expand. It puffed up. It became lighter. At first, it must have looked strange. Imagine seeing your dough grow all by itself. Many people might have thought it had spoiled, but someone decided to bake it anyway. As the dough entered the hot oven, the trapped gas expanded even more. Instead of producing another hard, flat cake, the bread rose into a soft, airy loaf with a light texture and a delicious aroma unlike anything people had tasted before. It was a revolutionary discovery. Without understanding the science, Egyptian bakers had learned how to harness fermentation. Over time, they even began saving a small piece of fermented dough to mix into the next batch, allowing them to make risen bread again and again. Today, we call this a sourdough starter. That accidental discovery transformed bread forever. No longer was it just a simple survival food. It became softer, tastier, and more satisfying than ever before. And as Egyptian civilization flourished, their remarkable baking techniques would spread far beyond the Nile, reaching the Greeks, the Romans, and eventually almost every corner of the world. Once people discovered how to make soft, risen bread, there was no turning back. The secret spread from ancient Egypt to neighboring civilizations, where each culture improved the recipe in its own way. The Greeks experimented with different grains, herbs, and baking techniques, creating dozens of varieties of bread. Some were sweet, others were savory, and some were reserved for religious ceremonies. Bread was no longer just a source of energy. It had become part of culture itself. Then came the Romans, and they took bread to an entirely new level. As the Roman Empire expanded across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, so did its bakeries. Professional bakers became highly respected craftsmen, and in many cities, enormous public bakeries worked day and night to feed thousands of people. Some bakeries produced so much bread that they looked more like factories than kitchens. The Romans also improved milling technology, building water-powered mills that could grind huge amounts of grain far faster than people ever could by hand. What once took hours of exhausting labor could now be done much more efficiently. Bread became one of the empire's most important foods. In fact, the Roman government understood a simple truth. A hungry population is an angry population. To keep the public satisfied, officials often distributed grain or bread to citizens. Feeding the people wasn't just an act of generosity. It was a way to maintain stability across a vast empire. By this point, bread had become much more than a recipe. It influenced politics. It supported armies on long campaigns. It fueled workers who built roads, bridges, and monuments. A food that had begun as a simple paste cooked on a hot stone had grown into one of the pillars of civilization. But despite all these advances, bread was still difficult to make. Every loaf required hours of hard work, and only skilled bakers could produce it consistently. That wouldn't change until a new age of machines transformed bread forever. For thousands of years, making bread was slow. Every loaf began with the same exhausting routine. Farmers harvested the grain by hand. Millers spent hours grinding it into flour. Bakers mixed the dough, waited for it to rise, and baked it in wood-fired ovens. A single loaf represented hours, sometimes days, of human labor. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, machines began doing jobs that had once required entire teams of people. Steam-powered mills could grind grain faster and more consistently than ever before. New steel roller mills produced finer, whiter flour in enormous quantities, making bread softer and cheaper than previous generations could have imagined. Bakeries changed too. Instead of baking dozens of loaves a day, factories could produce thousands. For the first time in history, bread became affordable for nearly everyone. But the biggest breakthrough came in the 20th century. In 1928, an inventor named Otto Frederick Rohwedder introduced the world's first successful machine that automatically sliced and wrapped bread. At first, many bakers thought it was unnecessary. Why would anyone pay for bread that was already sliced? They were completely wrong. People loved the convenience. The invention became so popular that it gave birth to a phrase we still use today: the best thing since sliced bread. Today, billions of loaves are baked every year in every corner of the world. Some are still made by hand using recipes that are thousands of years old. Others are produced by highly automated factories capable of baking tens of thousands of loaves every single day. Yet, despite all the technology, every loaf still follows the same basic idea discovered by our ancestors. Take grain, turn it into flour, mix it with water, add heat. A process that began with curious hunter-gatherers has survived for thousands of years, and it's still feeding humanity today. After more than 12,000 years, you might think humans have perfected bread, but its story is far from over. Today, scientists are developing new varieties of wheat that can survive droughts, extreme heat, and changing climates. As the world's population continues to grow, producing enough food for everyone has become one of humanity's greatest challenges, and bread remains at the center of that mission. At the same time, bakers are looking to the past for inspiration. Ancient grains like einkorn, emmer, and spelt, once staples of early civilizations, are making a comeback. Many people are rediscovering traditional sourdough, using fermentation methods that are remarkably similar to those practiced thousands of years ago. It's a fascinating contrast. On one side, giant automated factories can produce tens of thousands of loaves every hour. On the other, artisan bakers spend days crafting a single loaf by hand. Two completely different approaches, yet both trace their origins back to the same discovery made by our ancestors. And perhaps that's what makes bread so extraordinary. Despite all our technological advances, its basic recipe has barely changed. Grain, water, heat, time. If you enjoyed discovering how one simple invention changed the world, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and let me know in the comments, what everyday food should we uncover the history of next?